Looking deeper into different regime types, today we're going to talk a little bit about non-democratic regimes. Now, of course, the term non-democratic covers a very wide swath of different regime types. Still, it's useful, at least at first glance, to cut up the world into democratic and non-democratic regimes and then discuss variation as it arises. Now, authoritarian regimes can be hard to study. If they are personalistic, that is to say, or personalist, I think your book says, that means that the entire regime is organized around the personality and loyalty to a particular individual. Explanations of state behavior start becoming more like psychological explanations, right? So the bureaucracy of the state and the workings of the state tend to take on the peculiar personality of the person at the top. If the regimes aren't personalistic, often informal institutions tend to be important relative to formal ones. These informal institutions operate behind the scenes and therefore are difficult to study. So there is a facade of institutions that look a lot like the institutions of any country, but those those bureaucracies, ministries, offices, and so on and so forth have little to no real power and serve to mask what's really going on behind the scenes. And of course, if the regime is authoritarian enough and is cut off from the world in some ways, that information about them can be hard to come by, and so they're just hard to study. North Korea is typical of this. I don't know that anybody really knows what's going on inside North Korea. Okay, let's talk about institutionalization. Now, all governments are more predictable the more institutionalized they are. Institutionalization here just means that political decisions are reliably taken via established and routine procedures. These don't have to be necessarily formally spelled out in a constitution or statute, but they have to be well known by everyone, and they have to be enduring. We have to be able to predict the regime's behavior based on these reliable procedures. Now, authoritarian regimes struggle with institutionalization, perhaps more than democracies, because institutionalizing involves relinquishing some degree of control or power to procedures. And most authoritarian leaders, let's be honest, perceive a lack of control as a threat to their survival. So relinquishing control to, say, an independent judiciary, a legislature, even if it's only partially empowered, or some other group of people, or some other group of people acting according to basic rule of law, involves the risk of those institutions making decisions that go against the interests of those who created them and those who wield the most power. Now, we have to try, when talking about authoritarian regimes, we have to avoid this tendency to believe that all power resides at the top. It's true that there's a lot of significant concentrations of power in the state and often the person of a leader or a party, but no dictatorship is ever absolute. Even the most personalistic regimes that function on the whims of a ruler, like Libya under Gaddafi, for example, or like Ethiopia under Idi Amin. All leaders face constraints. All leaders need to find sources of support because one person, after all, is only so powerful. And this is a point I think that's made quite well by your companion reader from Bueno de Mesquita and Alistair Smith. No one rules alone. Everyone has to rely on support from someone, and that means that you have to strike bargains that establish a distribution of power. Let me give you examples of things that even powerful dictators are checked by. One, their own self-interest. You can do whatever you want, but obviously there are things that you can do as a dictator that will severely undermine your power, your chances of survival, and your economic interests. Dictators are also checked by other elites. Other elites may have their own sources of support, their own networks of loyalty within the regime, and so dictators never really know who is loyal to whom, often within either a bureaucracy or an army especially. Dictators are also checked by international pressures. Other states, international organizations, and world markets all pressure dictators and shape their behavior and shape the payoffs, that is to say, the benefits and the benefits and the burdens, I'm sorry, not the benefits and the burdens, the benefits and the costs of their behavior. Dictators often are also checked by either ancestral, let's say traditional legislatures, or legislatures that they created that are weak, but nonetheless provide outlets for popular sentiment that they're not free to ignore. Traditional clergy and other kinds of tribal leaders, for example, may all provide checks on the leader's exercise of unconstrained power. And finally, army officers. I mean, most directly, those people who control and inspire the loyalty of the army are those who most directly present a threat to dictators, and most directly the dictator has to satisfy. Now, just like democratic leaders, autocrats rule through a mix of repression, co-optation, and efforts at legitimation. The mix usually tilts more towards repression, which is relatively expensive compared to the other two options. It's expensive in total money, but of course it's cheaper if you're trying to stay in power. Loyalty is, of course, much cheaper because you don't have to spend money to ensure compliance. If people truly are loyal, they don't have to be threatened, but of course you're never sure in a dictatorship, and so you do often end up having to invest in more repression than would be optimal, than you need. But what this means overall is that even autocratic leaders invest a lot in securing legitimacy. I mean, massive, lavish military parades, giveaways and handouts at traditional festivals, big employment-driven projects, state-driven projects, even minor and easy-to-win wars. All of these secure the leader's legitimacy and enhance the likelihood that people will go along with the policies of the regime. Now, talking about repression, the army is usually very well taken care of in autocratic regimes, or at the very least, the elite units and the officers are well taken care of. Incoming dictators often also create a spy network or secret police that they personally control and that's loyal to them. So if there are institutionalized aspects to the regime, the leader will feel the need often to secure his own source of personal support and power by keeping tabs on everyone through an agency or a part of the government that is only accountable to them. These off-secret polices and spy networks often work in parallel to other institutions like the police and army, which are charged with ordinary law enforcement. And this creation of parallel institutions of monitoring and control first is a source of inefficiency. It costs money, but there's a point to it, which is that they bypass ordinary institutions, they prevent institutionalization from taking place, and often provide early warning to leaders who get themselves into trouble. In the case of the Shah of Iran, for instance, he was very clearly tipped off that a revolution was going to happen, and so he fled to Rome and then Paris, I think. In Iran today, although Iran has competitive elections up to a point, there is also a parallel network of enforcers, the Basiji. In Hitler, of course, in Hitler's Germany, of course, the Gestapo was the secret police. The Stasi in East Germany was notorious. In the Soviet Union, I forget if it was Smersh, maybe. So, yeah, most autocratic regimes have not most, but many of these autocratic regimes have these secret polices that, again, make institutionalization harder by bypassing ordinary government institutions. Okay, another way to minimize the cost of ruling and maximize the chance of political survival is to make sure that key players in government are people you can trust. And how do you do that? Well, the most popular way is to use family members. If you have a large family or extended kinship group, you put them in positions of power and trust, because at the end of the day, these are the people who are most likely to be in your corner. They have reasons to like you that are independent of how much money you're giving them, or how much you're threatening them, for that matter. So it's not surprising that most authoritarian political organizations throughout history have been kinship based, but even today, you see lots of rulers give key positions to powerful family members, regardless of competency at the particular job that they've been selected for. Co-optation is important in autocratic regimes. If there is a formal opposition, one way to weaken it is to create symbolic positions for leader of the opposition that have some small amounts of power to affect change, but not enough to challenge the regime. The hope is that by paying off these opponents, those opponents will want to keep these perks of their new positions, and will want to and therefore will be more likely to play ball with the regime. These cushy these cushy appointments tend to reduce the overall level of opposition, or make it less strident, or make it more accommodating, because again, these leaders of the opposition do not want to be left out from the spoils, and they also know that if they get too vocal in their displeasure with the regime, they can either be replaced or executed potentially, and someone else will take their place as the token opposition. If there is no formal opposition of this sort, channeling discontent into safe venues is also an option. Creating weak parliaments, we've talked about that in semi-authoritarian regimes. Government unions, we've talked about in fascist regimes and bureaucratic authoritarian regimes, where within the structure of that union, grievances can be brought, but those grievances are tightly controlled and influenced in some ways by the regime. And finally, mandatory party membership. So if everybody's a member of the party, then the party becomes within itself a forum for discussion, potential reform, and opposition. But again, tightly controlled by procedures that are set up to ultimately often get the right answer, the answer that the regime wants. So this idea of elections and parliaments as a way to co-opt the opposition is especially popular in the second half of the 20th century with dictatorships. Dictators realize that they can give up a little bit of power to parliaments, raising the hopes of the people that they will achieve some form of popular sovereignty and self-determination, but while still holding on to the reins. This is particularly popular in Gulf monarchies of the Middle East these days, in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, all of whom have monarchies but have also elected legislatures, but these legislatures are only allowed to rule on fairly minor issues, or issues that don't threaten the security of the regime itself. This veneer of democracy can also help misdirect international commentators and international institutions and NGOs by convincing outsiders that there is a greater degree of participation and freedom, or that those limits on freedom and civil liberties that are in place are in fact the will of the people, and so are not objectionable. Moreover, knowing that the elections are rigged, or that even if you win the elections, you won't be able to do much to exert fundamental change, that can also discourage challengers and make the regime appear much more legitimate than it is, because the regime's own candidates will presumably win more seats, not because they are more popular, but because opponents just decided it wasn't worth running. And in those circumstances, of course, the vote totals are going to look very, very lopsided. And of course, in those semi-authoritarian regimes that I talked about in your last lecture, that's what you see. Generally speaking, pro-regime candidates are re-elected in overwhelming majorities, which helps them claim that they have a mandate to rule and a very strong support among the population, whereas in reality, what this probably reflects is a mix of intimidation, discouragement, and simply the lack of importance of those particular positions. Okay, so creating dependency. Well, this is part of co-optation, but this is not unique to dictatorships. This happens in democracies as well. But one of the ways to secure a basis of political support is to create an economically dependent constituency, or perhaps politically dependent constituency, and therefore get its support. This reminds me of Christians in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was very much aware that that Christians posed very little threat to his rule, but at the same time he could choose whether to allow them to be more persecuted or less persecuted, whether he could allow them to practice or not practice their religion as much. And so the key figure there's an Iraqi Christian named Tariq Aziz, who was foreign minister during the Gulf War, very loyal to Saddam Hussein, and he was sort of a paradigmatic case of a politically dependent, or a member of a politically dependent constituency. The strategy here is to elevate unpopular minorities to key positions, and they know full well that if it weren't for the person who elevated them, their fates would be much, much worse. Creating patronage networks helps also people stay economically dependent, and patronage networks here are just simply lists of jobs and other economic opportunities, in some cases loans and investments, in some cases it's even just seeds and farm implements, but these are resources that the regime controls, that it can dole out in exchange for political support. Of course, when it comes to talking to IMF and World Bank economists, these people will, these authoritarian regimes will find ways to justify these expenditures, but frequently the logic behind them is not economic, but instead political, in trying to secure a base of support that is very loyal. So we've gone over some of the essential features of most authoritarian regimes. They do face a typical number of problems. There isn't much evidence, cross-national study evidence, that authoritarian regimes perform economically worse than democracies. Most authoritarian regimes are poorer, but most poor countries, poor democracies don't grow any faster than poor dictatorships. One of the interesting sort of stylized facts that we've discovered about the relationship between regime type, in this case democracy and authoritarianism, and economic growth is that authoritarian regimes tend to perform at the top and at the bottom. Authoritarian regimes are some of the fastest growing countries in the world, and they're also some of the fastest imploding countries in the world. Whereas democracies tend to be more middling. Their performance tends to cluster more around the middle, whereas, again, authoritarian regimes are at the extremes. They grow fast, or they grow negatively, but they don't have as much economic stability. Another typical problem for an authoritarian regime is a lack of accurate information. Nobody wants to be the one to tell the leader that his program failed, that people do not care for him, which means there are very few official and trustworthy channels that a leader can trust and rely on for feedback. And if it's a personalist regime, then the failure of a policy, is a chink in the armor of the leader. If it's a modernizing authoritarian regime, then the failure of the policy harms the legitimacy, the right to rule of the leaders, because after all, their rule is legitimated by economic performance in a modernizing authoritarian regime. And finally, if it's a communist or a fascist dictatorship, public recognition or public information about the failures of programs, they're delegitimized as the ideology itself, which is supposed to be the one to bring about prosperity and success. And so no one in the regime has any interest in receiving any interest. Nobody has any incentive to give the members of the regime, especially the leaders, accurate feedback, and so therefore it takes a long time for problems to become recognized and to become obvious. This was particularly true in China during the Great Leap Forward, where millions died before officials became convinced and realized that there was a real problem, because everybody was lying and telling the leaders that everything was going just fine. So this is the so-called dictator's dilemma, or this actually leads to the dictator's dilemma. So on the one hand, we said that the leaders in autocratic regimes had a hard time getting accurate feedback and adjusting their policies in consequence. That's not the dictator's dilemma. The dictator's dilemma is when the ruler, through a lack of feedback, isn't 100% sure about how much support he has. And so he invests too much into repression, and this is wasteful of resources from the leader's point of view and the country's point of view. Too much money goes into security forces, the secret police, the army, and so on and so forth, because nobody will really officially tell the leader how much support he has, and indeed there's no metric to figure it out. Like in an election, you know how many people voted for you. But in a dictatorship, without elections or with rigged elections, there's no real reliable way of knowing whether the people are going to revolt tomorrow or whether they'll be just fine and are accepting of your rule. So what this means is that dictators tend to spend more on the military as a fraction of GDP than democracies on average, and this is in part explained by this lack of feedback and this uncertainty about the level of support. And of course, if you are uncertain about your level of support, then you are definitely going to overinvest, right? Better be safe than sorry, because of course in a democracy, when you are kicked out of power, you go on a book tour and maybe you get an honorary professorship at a university. In a dictatorship, when you get kicked out of power, you're usually leaving in a coffin, and that therefore the incentive to be better safe than sorry is overwhelming. So that's the dictator's dilemma. And that just about concludes our lecture on authoritarian regimes. I hope you'll join me in a little bit to discuss different kinds of democracies.